Next up, we're going to have our CISO panel. We've got some great participants and great panelists on the representing the civilian government, DoD, state and local, the District of Columbia. Really good, broad representation of what our governments are facing out there. Tony Cole will be moderating this panel. I kid around with Tony. Tony loves this stuff. This is your calling up here, Tony. So thank you for doing this. I've worked for Tony for years. One thing I like about Tony, he has a view of government, global government, where he's traveling to Europe, Asia, South America, all over the globe. One of the few people here at FireEye, outside of people like Kevin Mandia, Travis Reese, and a few others, that really has a really good global government perspective here. So if you haven't met Tony, afterwards, go up and introduce yourself. Tony retired from the U.S. Army. Thank you for your service. He's been in the security space for over 30 years. There's very few people who I look at as thought leaders than I do as Tony Cole. And without any further ado, Tony Cole. He's got to jump. He had a broken foot a few months ago. Let me help you up there, Tony. He is retired.
Thank you, Pat. So, well, good morning. Thank you all for being here today. I hope you enjoyed Kevin's keynote earlier today and the other keynote from the Good Admiral. So I think it's an exciting agenda we have for you, throughout the entire day today. So I can't see any of you today, so these are some super bright lights today. So we're going to actually talk about, enabling the government CISO, to command and protect their enterprise. And we've got some great speakers lined up for you. So I'd like to, without further ado, call them right up here. So first of all, Mr. Matt Connor. So he's the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer and Deputy Director of Cybersecurity Office at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Matt, can you make that title any longer? So also we have Marty Eckert, so the Chief Information Security Officer at the Social Security Administration, and she is responsible for the agency's cybersecurity program, ensuring the protection of the agency's vast information technology resources. Also joining us is Mr. Mitchell Komarov. So Mitch is a Director of Cybersecurity Implementation and Acquisition Integration for the DoD Chief Information Officer. So yours may be longer than Matt's, so congratulations for that. That's awesome. And without last but not least, so is John McMichael, who is a retired Navy and is currently the Chief Information Security Officer, so for the District of Columbia. So as you can see, we've got kind of a mix here, which is really, really important to have a perspective, from all different areas. So the intelligence community, the defense community, the civilian government agency, and also the DC government from the local level. So as much as DC can be considered local, kind of a hybrid there. So, but I know they need a lot of help in DC, and they're in good hands with John, so which is great. So we have really a very interesting place that we're at today. We've watched the adversaries evolve over the last 22, 24 years as we've connected our networks to the internet. And for quite a period of time there, we did not get very much attention, in this space today, where the correct resources, staffing, funding, and all those other pieces that are attached to it were given to the people actually to protect our environment. Because quite frankly, people didn't think it was that important. We saw lots of opportunistic attacks. And then we started to see a shift towards targeted attacks, where they were going after individuals so they can get access to the assets behind them. And today we're starting to see some destructive attacks, as well as ransomware attacks that are even impacting government. So my point is, we're seeing the adversary continue to evolve. So these people have a very difficult and challenging job on a continuous basis, so trying to actually see where the adversary is going, so protect their environment, their customers, and those assets from all of the previous threats as the adversary evolved, because much of those threats still bounce around the internet today, but at the same time look to see where they're going to. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that today. And I'd like to start actually by allowing each one of them to provide just a minute or two of their own opening thoughts. And Matt, if we can start with you and go right down the line for the start.
Thanks, Tony. It's a privilege to be here to represent NGA. We are a twofer. We are both an intelligence agency and a Department of Defense combat support agency. We're also one of the big five intelligence agency who hasn't yet had our crown jewels leaked on the internet, so very proud of that.
Don't say that out loud.
Day's not over yet. If people aren't familiar with NGA, if you've ever flown on a plane with instruments, sailed a boat using charts, used a GPS-enabled app, you're using NGA products. Anything that happens in space and time happens in a place, and it's our mission to understand that place, the geospatial context for all that information. We are in the midst of a couple of big initiatives right now. One's called GeoInt Services, as we push to put GeoInt in the hands of consumers across the internet, across the system for GeoInt, both the allied and federal spaces, and contributing to the community. That push into the internet, the Succeed in the Open initiative, raises our threat level, our risk level, and it also raises our attention level in a good way. We're having conversations with leaders that we never had before, and it's a real privilege.
Thank you. Marty.
Good morning, everyone. Okay. Just want to say thank you, Tony, for having me here today. I've been the CISO at the Social Security Administration. I think most of you are probably familiar with the mission of Social Security. Touches your life throughout, from birth through retirement, as you work. And one of the things I think I'd like to start with is I've been there 4 years in this role, and there's been a lot of changes to pick up on what Tony said. So there's been changes in the threat environment, changes in technology, changes in government compliance and the direction that we've received across the federal space. And I can say that it's never dull or boring to be the Chief Information Security Officer, but it has opened us up to a lot of opportunity to see the business. And I think security has become more and more integrated into the business, whether it's our online applications and the folks doing business with us from the public, either online or in our offices, or whether it's the protection of all American citizens' data. We become more and more integral, security has become more and more integral to the business and to our infrastructure, our technology. And in that way, I think what we'll continue to see is that CISO role will become more integral to the business and become more of a partner, especially when you think about what our role really is, which is managing risk. So managing risk at that enterprise level. I do look forward to taking questions from you later.
Thank you, Marty. Mitch.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I'm a director within the CISO's organization for the Department of Defense. My organization lives within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So our organization, that is the entirety of the Department of Defense, allows us to see individual organizational functions under a magnifying glass because we're managing an organization of a couple of million people spread out across 4 military departments, I guess around 16 defense agencies and numerous field activities with worldwide operations running from business operations through combat operations. So from that vantage point, the CISO has a unique role of ensuring that the enterprise in its entirety has an adequate cybersecurity program. And so from a DoD perspective, that requires that we think across what we call the .MLPF space, which is actually a mouthful. It's so basically doctrine, organization, training, materiel, leadership, personnel, facilities, and policy. Or I think from a more CIO perspective, people, processes, and technology. So ultimately, we in the IT space, whether it's security or for mission function, have a tendency to focus on the technical piece of the puzzle, when in fact paying attention to that entire spectrum of organizational considerations is vital to our mission. Equally important, and we see this clearly in the department, where even within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, there are numerous principal staff assistants advising the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff regarding matters integral to cybersecurity, while the CISO has a preeminent role in that regard. Understanding the roles of all your related organizations is vital.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thanks,
John.
Mitch. You hit dot mil poof right out of the gate, so I get to check that off my bingo card. Tony, thanks for having me. I see some familiar friendly faces and some familiar unfriendly faces too, so it's good to see. It's good to see all of you. I'm John McMichael. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of Washington, D.C. I work for Archa Vamulapalli, who's the Chief Technology Officer. And so I work for DC government. So we get confused with big federal DC all the time, which isn't good from a threat management standpoint. But within DC, there are, under mayoral mandate, there are roughly 100 organizations, police, fire, retirement, healthcare, schools, emergency management, everything you can think of to run a city. So there are about 100 organizations, about 30,000 employees, and about six or 700 residents, all working together. So within the Chief Technology Officer's agency, our mandate is to provide the technology, programs, and applications so that the other agencies can get their job done and that they can do it in a smart way. Over the years, it's been a more federated response, and our CTO has really moved it into an enterprise response. And so you talked about what the chief challenge for us is: how do you move a large organization from federated to enterprise? So if you were in the Navy in 2005, which I was, right, we've seen this done before, where there are a lot of ways to do it. In the Navy, we moved to NMCI, and we're doing something similar with the city government as we move towards a more federated response to both technology but also information security. So under my group, I've got the SOC, the GRC teams, the cybersecurity architects, and our mandate is to provide the cybersecurity stack for the city of Washington, D.C., as well as the policies, plans, and technology and services for all the agencies.
Thank you, John. You know, it's so great to have a panel like this, so with such diverse backgrounds from different perspectives, but I think for people that really get the problem that we have today. You know, you're probably all aware on the defense side, you know, that DoD was one of the first out there to consider, you know, cybersecurity, you know, or cyber, I should say, you know, an operational domain, you know, where they have to actually fight and defend. And NATO last year, you know, at the Warsaw Summit actually recognized it as an operational domain as well. And I think what many organizations, especially in the commercial world, still have problems with today is they don't realize that, you know, if, you know, we deployed an army somewhere and the Navy somewhere to actually fight a battle, so that's all well and good. But today, you know, in cyberspace, we're all interconnected. So from the, you know, the DC government to the companies that are actually sitting inside DC, to Social Security, to NGA, to the defense side, everything is interconnected. So there is no hard and firm line, you know, in between these organizations, you know, when somebody is actually attacking us, you know, in the operational domain of cyber. So on that note, I'd like to start with the first question. You know, we've seen the adversary evolve their tactics and tools significantly over the years, as I mentioned in the opening, to take advantage of new and generally vulnerable systems. Do you think the attackers' levels of sophistication will continue to increase in relation to our increased levels of security so that we see today? So, and Marty, would you mind kicking us off on that one?
So I think the simple answer is yes, we'll see the continued evolution of the adversaries and stuff. But I think we also need to keep in mind that we'll also see the continued evolution.
Oh, your mic might be off.
I asked you at the beginning. Can you hear me now? No? I am on.
Yep, she's bringing another one up right now. Can't do a live demo without problems. Oh,
Okay.
I think I'm off too now.
Well, that's what our job's all about, right? Flexibility, changing in priorities. being able to respond to the unexpected.
Yeah, I think our whole system just went down.
We've been hacked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can do that.
Yep. Oh, I'm still on.
Oh,
Wait, are you on?
we're back
I'm on.
Am I on?
Yep, you're on.
We're all on.
Hey.
I think we're all
Thank
on.
goodness.
I was up for standing up and talking loud.
So what was the question again? No. I think it was are the tactics against us going to continue to evolve?
Exactly.
And will our responses evolve as well? So the short answer is yes. The adversary will continue to evolve their tactics, but we will become more and more sophisticated in our defenses too. And I think, the CISO role being one of responsibility and paranoia is also one of optimism. We do believe that there are things that we can do to respond and to take, and what we'll also see, I think, is the evolution of technology, and also we'll become more proactive in our defenses. So while, yes, I think that tactics against us will continue to evolve and mature, but I think that our defenses and our ability to not just respond, but to act and advance will also continue to evolve.
John, you have something to add?
I do, and I absolutely agree with you, Marty. It's that they're going to continue to evolve, and in the federal space and the government space, we're going to continue to evolve. And maybe out of kind of a little to the left of your question is, the people I worry about is this gulch of not a large organization, not a mid-sized organization, but everyone else, right? How do they continue to evolve? How do they get the baseline controls and programs in place to respond? And so I think if you're aligned to a federal program, if you're standing on top of NIST, if you're standing on top of a federal program, if you're aligned to healthcare, high trust, or if you're a banking industry and you're regulated, I think that puts you in a great place, but there's still a large number of organizations not as big as ours, and I'm not sure what the answer is for them outside of some sort of managed service, right? Or not that I'm promoting a managed service, but if you're, for those of you selling it, but what do you do if you're these smaller organization? I think there are a lot of smaller organizations that have to answer this question. I don't think we've sorted that out yet.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge that I see, and I use the little analogy. If you run a dry cleaning business, and,
Right.
In this corner of the state, you probably don't have the resources and the funding for your cybersecurity practice to take on a nation state. And the big question is, do you have to take on a nation state?
Right.
So Mitch, you had something to add?
Yes, and this kind of theme will recur throughout I think our discussion, so I'll take just a second to say that we think about this question, try and think about this analytically, and we kind of have a sense that tradecraft in general will evolve from the most sophisticated down. So basically, the top peg of the most capable adversaries or advanced persistent threat, I think is the phrase that's used today, that capability will evolve relatively slowly, but it will evolve and get more sophisticated. But all the actors beneath that most sophisticated level, they're actually, in general, moving up the scale. So everybody's becoming more sophisticated. Even the tools that I think you see on the internet as a perfectly visible measure or metric of sophistication is continuing to advance, and thereby enabling less sophisticated actors that don't understand how to, say, build these tools themselves to actually have impact. And then lastly, probably the most rapidly evolving is the emergence of specific threats. These are just, as vulnerabilities are discovered, the ability to actually exploit them. So these kinds of considerations and understanding the level of threat is important, and equally important is how particular threat steps actually link together in an attack life cycle that can actually go from some remote spot on the internet to causing organizational damage for you. So we'll recur on this kind of theme, but being very as careful as you can get about what the threat is vital to being able to respond adequately to it.
Thank you, Mitch. Matt, you had something to add?
Well, just as the last speaker, it's hard to do much but violently agree with what everybody else said. But I do want to add the human dimension to the tools, tradecraft, and development. It's important to remember that people are at the root of our systems. 40% of attacks use spear phishing and social engineering components to it. So while we think about this as an arms race, we think about our defensive solutions developing commensurately with the aggressive solutions. Our people are a huge part of our successful defense. Continuing to educate them, continuing to build systems that apply technical controls around places where people can fail to ensure sort of a more well-rounded defense. We're spending a lot of time and money right now trying to invest in our people, education. Obviously, we want idiot-proof solutions, but we also know you can build better idiots. So we're trying to educate our users.
So I appreciate that, and quite frankly, I'm still hopeful that I'll see one government be the first to actually implement gamification in security user awareness. Haven't seen it anywhere yet because it's a difficult task for government to do that because it takes a lot of funding, but nevertheless, I'm hopeful that happens. So, another question, and I'm going to randomly pick here a couple out. It's very interesting today. You see a lot of CISOs in the federal space will come up and they'll, here's my FISMA score, here's my FITARA score, here's how Congress is rating me. There's a lot of metrics, to look out across the board. But all of those metrics are typically compliance-driven versus risk-driven. And we know you can be compliant and get pretty good scores and still get hacked today because it doesn't completely mitigate your risk. Nothing completely mitigates your risk today. But nevertheless, do you actually see a compliance-led strategy so as beneficial to your organization, or do you work risk mitigation first? And I'll toss it out one to anyone that wants to jump in first. Right, Matt, go ahead.
Sure, I'll take it just because I brought my axe that I wanted to grind here on stage about compliance. Right, thank you. That's an easy answer for us, is we're very interested in risk and we're not terribly interested in compliance. We've got hundreds of findings from audits, assessments, and inspections. Many of them do not correlate to risks, or they correlate to, upon analysis, very low risks. They aren't the things that are going to eat our lunch. They're Policy X isn't left-hand justified 12-point Arial font, therefore is non-compliant. I got reams and reams of those, which we pejoratively refer to as the clipboard army. We are working real hard to translate our security program in terms of risk and impact to leadership. So we have various processes at our agency whereby leadership is advised of the age of findings as if that in of itself means something. And we're at pains right now to explain to them that doesn't matter to me as much as this other risk. So our cybersecurity strategy, woo, thank you. I got a fan.
You'll be here all day.
So our cybersecurity strategy, our program is across the NIST cybersecurity framework as it would be, but we're really measuring risk dimensions there, and we're trying to ensure that work that we do, things that we buy down risk, not close compliance findings. End of speech.
That's great. Mitch, you have something to add?
Yeah, so I think natively, and I think intellectually, all of us are going to be inclined towards the risk-based approach because ultimately it stands to reason. But I think that ultimately at the organizational level, things are actually a little bit more complex than that. Ultimately, risk management is kind of like conscious thinking. We can only do a certain amount of it. Much of what we do ultimately has to become visceral and be done without thought. That ability to act kind of intelligently without actually having to consciously think is ultimately, the analog here, is the realm of compliancy. So ultimately, what we need to be able to do is think a lot about what we want our system security architectures to be within our organizations, and then we need to really have a culture of compliance with the dictates that those system security architectures imply. And ultimately, we do need to manage exceptions, and we will find, I think, that ultimately where we place that decision making within the organization for exceptions to matters that we've all decided are so important as the cyber basics, that ultimately up in the realm of compliance when we thought things out well becomes crucial to achieving results. And ultimately, when I say where we put the decision within the organization, that decision-making authority to make an exception to what we've established to be a required action becomes a matter of responsibility and principally commander's leadership responsibility.
All right. Thank you, Mitch. Anything to add?
No, I think we're probably all going to be in the same place. And I think we're all going to say the same thing, that we want to approach it from a risk-based perspective. I think with that said, there is the reality that compliance, the word compliance, right, is you're complying with something and you're tasked by some agency to comply. And so I think for me, I think of compliance as table stakes in the game of cyber poker, right? You have to go in on your compliance. You have to know where you stand with it. You can't ignore it, but that's not your driver, right? You look at your compliance, you fill out, you have your status, you identify compensating controls, you're able to report on it, but that's not your cybersecurity.
Marty?
Yeah, just to add to that, it is a risk-based approach, and I think that is the number one thing with everyone, and we all are frustrated when we have compliance findings that are lower risk, and we know there are things we have to focus on. But I do think that compliance can become complementary to our risk-based approach, and we've been able to leverage at times compliance-related requirements so that we could get something that we thought was high risk completed.
Oh, that's great to hear. I mean, it's one of, I think my mic's off? No, it's on.
It's on.
And it's one of the things that, that we see out there around the globe, talking with, governments and getting to understand everybody's vulnerable, breaches are going to happen. The whole concept is, how quickly can you identify that breach so it mitigate the impact? So you build a 10-foot wall, your cybersecurity posture, somebody shows up with an 11-foot ladder, right? So even if they show up with that 11-foot ladder, can you recognize the fact there's a ladder there where somebody can get in, and very quickly actually mitigate that risk. So they may get in, but they don't steal anything. And that's the point I think that we're at today. So based on that, there are numerous lessons in the physical world, about, how we should actually operate, around security. From that note, think about today, if one of our military services goes into an engagement somewhere around the world, they're in some today, right? The first thing they do before they go is they use the intelligence apparatus to actually understand the risk to them and everything about that adversary and that environment that we know. But for some reason, we don't apply that, as frequently as we should to the cyber realm. We should know more about those adversaries. On that note, I'd like to ask our panelists, do you feel an intelligence-led cyber strategy is important to your organization to defend your assets today? Mitch?
I'll take it this way. So when I take you to mean intelligence-led more as threat-based.
Yes.
As opposed to specifying any type of organizational decision. And I think that historically, I think that we've all been kind of vulnerability-based in our thinking. And what we have found over time is that treating this domain from a threat-based perspective eliminates a lot of the hand-waving associated with thinking about, particularly from a resourcing perspective and from a risk perspective. So going back to my earlier comments, ultimately we've been thinking about this problem from a threat lifecycle perspective. How does a particular threat steps actually interact with the information flows within your system security architecture, and what countermeasures or security controls do you have in place to stop those threats? We also think about it from a level of sophistication perspective, because that implies a certain concept of strength of countermeasure. And so ultimately, we believe that when you're in an argument with, or I should say in a discussion with somebody over resources or whether or not to constrain operations in order to achieve a security objective, having very clear attack chains that lead to specific consequences within your organization really clarifies the discussion.
Thank you, Mitch. Anyone else? John?
Probably similar to what Mitch said, but different. So at the state and municipal, tribal, local level, we're members of MSISAC, and I'll get this wrong, Multi-State Information something. Thanks. There's a member. Sharing and Analysis Center. And so one of the things that we get a lot of benefit from is being able to share data in a non-attribution environment, and it's a very strong ISAC. And some of the ISACs are strong, some are less strong, but these state ones, federally funded, it's incredibly strong. And we get lots of queuing and tipper information of things that are going on in other states. We don't always know where it is that we're able to act on. And so at the federal level, I'm sure you have different queuing than we do, but for us it's been incredibly helpful to be aware of what other attacks are going on. There's a phishing attack, a spear phishing attack recently in another state, which we were able to prevent before it started because we were aware that the state had been attacked, and so we were able to take that information and wholly prevent it before it got to our system. In the DC area, there's also the Metropolitan Council of Governments that ties together all the state and the local level CIOs, CISO, and governments. And I don't know if anyone here is a member of that. I'm looking for, nope. But if you're a member of that, it's also in this region, it's also a very strong way of sharing information.
Thank you, John. Matt, you had something to add?
Just a little. How about now? Yep. Just a little bit. I think it's hugely important from a threat perspective. I think that's one of the variables that we don't really resolve well in risk management algebra in terms of trying to understand likelihood of exploitation. You talked about applying scarce resources. I know we have a question later about challenges. I'll go ahead and own one of ours. Our GRC risk management framework kind of space is too separate from our C&D space, where there is a lot of threat intelligence information available in our C&D space and not as much applied to our A&A risk management framework kind of space. It's an area we're working to converge right now. As we exercise the risk management framework, considering vulnerabilities, all those kinds of things, we don't have actionable threat intelligence there in that space right now. So our risk management algebra ends in an unresolved variable, and that's certainly a growth area for us.
I appreciate that. So, Marty, did you have something?
I think I would just like to pick up on something that you said, because threat analysis and intelligence for us is just part of a holistic and integrated program, and we've spent a lot of time over the past 4 years integrating the various disciplines within cyber. So when you said that your threat analysis versus your CDM folks, and trying to get everyone to see how they all work together and how everything fits together. And this is definitely an area where we have tried to spread the wealth, so to speak. So yes, it's integral to our program, but it's one facet of that, and see how we can integrate that and make it a holistic approach.
That's great to hear, because it's such a critical area from my perception in talking to governments around the globe, to actually think about, who are the adversaries that want access to these assets I'm trying to defend, why do they want access to them, and then build your structure, appropriately. So, and of course, that's the basics of risk mitigation, right? So at this point, we don't have a lot of time left, so I'd like to take some questions from the audience. If I could see the audience, that would help tremendously, but, and I'm sure we have some microphones out here. I see one in the very back right over here. Sir, microphone's coming.
So I don't want to be too critical. I work for the federal government like a lot of folks here, but we really don't practice what we preach. A lot of people on the panel said all the right things about using a threat-based approach. Matt, you're right about the RMF, not using actionable threat information. I don't think people overall really know how to use a risk-based approach. We've been so focused on compliance for years with FISMA that we really need to teach practitioners how to do that properly and make sure we communicate that to leadership.
I think that's a great point and well taken, and now we have some new leadership in cyber, and I think that's a great message we could provide. So, other questions?
Can I just try to respond to that question just real quick?
Yeah.
I think one of our challenges where we're interested right now is allowing different schools of thought to be part of our cybersecurity program. And I'm about to blaspheme here, even though I've got a number of certifications, and say that I think certification industry inculcates a certain approach, a certain way of thinking as well, and I think we need to think a little more broadly about that. We're really working hard to recruit people out of college, intern programs, comp sci programs, those kinds of things. Not necessarily been part of the machine for a real long time because they have that FISMA is gospel kind of approach, but people who have sort of new approaches to those types of challenges. So violent agreement with the speaker who you couldn't pick him out of a lineup from up here. I can't see.
So Marty, you had something to add there?
Yeah, I think just to respond a little bit more, you made a point about educating the executives, right? And we have a lot of challenges, and that's a specific challenge for us. Because of what you mentioned, they get a lot of direction about the compliance metrics. And they see a lot of how we compare against other agencies, and they get those reports, and they're asked to be accountable for how their agencies are doing. So we have to educate them on that compliance-based approach. And in addition to that, then explain how that compliance-driven approach also can assist with the risk-driven approach and risk management, because we do want, and it is our responsibility, to educate them about what their real risks are, not just what the compliance factors are.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because nobody gets called to the Hill to testify because they've mitigated most of their risk, right? So it's actually over, where are they in compliance? Mitch, you had something to add?
The only thing I was going to add is that within the DoD, we've been working towards an explicit requirement to, beyond policy, but more from a requirement in the sense of something that our acquisition programs have to build to as other key performance parameters that are provided to them when they field a system. And that's our system survivability performance parameter, which made threat an explicit characterization of that requirement. And so I think that this kind of thinking will continue to impact where the RMF goes. Threat-based is there, but it's not a system categorization level thing. And I think that it will
Yeah, it's a good point. The holy grail of cybersecurity today, right? A resilient infrastructure where you can continue operating regardless of a breach and mitigate the impact quickly. And I'm sure there are a couple other questions. This young lady here was the first one I saw, maybe the only one I saw, actually. Microphone's coming. And then there was a gentleman over here. If someone could start taking a microphone in that direction as well.
1 minute.
Oh, sorry. We'll have one in the back here in a second. Okay, go right ahead.
Oh. Hi there. Thank you all for all that information. It's really interesting to hear. My name's Colleen, and I was wondering, there are so many factors that can come into play, obviously, in terms of improving our cybersecurity posture within the federal government. I was wondering, among them, between training, not only of executive level, but all the way down within an agency, versus culture, versus legacy IT, versus funding, which hasn't really come up. What do you think is the most important, and I guess where should we start from there?
We could do another whole panel just on that question. So if you could, so we can get a couple more questions, keep your responses brief, please. And John, I see you leaning forward there.
I think you said, where do you start? And I think it depends on the size of your agency, what you're aligned to. For me, I always look to how's my cyber hygiene, right? Because that is kind of the first 5 of SANS, CIS, NIST, whatever you are, and how's my cyber hygiene? I look at that first. I really like training, but every time we do, and we do active phishing campaigns, every time we do it, I'm saddened every time we do it.
Mitch.
Just briefly, within the department, we've really tried to align these concepts with readiness and ultimately a commander's readiness. I really do think that it's easy through the training culture thing to talk about somebody lower in the organization that clicks on the link, when it's shot to him in an email. And the reality is, I think that it's really a leadership issue. When leadership understands that in order to be secure, we may have to actually constrain other desirable things. and they actually reward somebody for going the extra mile in something that achieves a security objective as opposed to necessarily the immediate operational objective. I think that that's the kind of thing that ultimately changes culture. I think that we're all not quite there yet.
All right, thank you, Mitch. Very briefly, Matt.
I want to just hit on culture, the importance of culture to us. We're trying to convince leadership that security is not something we buy, it's something we do, and I apologize to all the vendors in the room. But we are, from a security perspective as well, within the security program, we want to espouse a culture of mission enabling, not know what was the question, which is sort of the age-old security. So to the point of, we're here to achieve an objective, we're trying to, we're modeling that, I don't know if it's apocryphal story about the janitor at the Johnson Space Center when asked by the president, what are you doing? He said, I'm putting a man on the moon. We're doing GEOINT. Everybody in security, we're doing GEOINT. We're not doing security for compliance sake. We're not doing security for the program's sake. We're not stopping the hackers. We're doing GEOINT. And so I think that culture is very important. If we keep that in mind, we try to find a way to say yes.
And I will add, so I appreciate that on the vendors. So instead, you shouldn't have vendors, you should have partners that should be helping you solve the problem.
Learned something today.
Yeah,
Thank
if
you.
you don't, get them out. So we had a question in the back. Somebody was waiting back here, and I can't see, but I'm sure they have a microphone.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. What are some of the things you're doing to work with CFOs of your organization or mission program owners to get some of the resources that you need to have more control or influence in the programs to further progress your security posture?
Marty, you want to start us on that one?
Actually, I'm going to try to connect that with where Matt just was on culture. You had asked us to prepare what were some of our biggest challenges, what were our accomplishments, et cetera. And where I would have gone with what have we achieved is we have been successful somewhat in changing culture. And the way that I think that impacts your question is, we used to be the people, the security folks, if you're as old as I am, we used to be the people that people avoided. This was, we weren't the most popular employees. So where we've been successful, though, is that now people do seek out our advice and our opinion, and much earlier in their projects, and are trying to build security in instead of add it on at the end. So while we still have a lot of work to do, we've been able to change that culture a bit. That makes it easier when we're working with the CFO and the folks in the budget shop and others, and where we're competing for those resources. Because they do now see the value that security brings to enabling the business, because that's really what the value is. We always say that our role is to enable the business securely. And you always are juggling that balance between convenience, because we know their expectations are higher today for convenience, and then protecting and defending.
It's a great point. A lot of us forget that have been in this field for a long time. It's like, oh, users are a big problem. But without users, none of us have a job. So actually, what I'd like to do here, no more questions. We're actually running out of time. So I'd love to actually go right down the line. We'll start with John this time, coming back this way. And in 60 seconds or less, give me your final thoughts.
I started off with my bingo card, and I think we've hit all the bingo things. And one of the questions you asked us that we didn't get to is your biggest challenge. And I think that's the completion of my bingo card. And the biggest challenges today are matching your resources with your tools and making that argument, retaining people, and moving to a single pane of glass, right? Because everyone has, all my partners here have some esoteric solution that they'd like to sell me that doesn't federate into any of my current panes of glass, and I need to go hire another 1/3 of a man year to manage it.
All right. Thank you, John. Mitch?
No, really appreciate the great discussion. I also, just because you never get a chance to actually talk with this many smart folks to tell you about some of our problems. So ultimately, we do believe situational awareness within the infrastructure is a really difficult problem. Design patterns for all the new things emerging in the Internet of Things remains something that's a challenge, and workforce issues, the ability, we're all tapping into a very scarce knowledge base in this business. So how do we actually promote the development of that skill set? Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Marty?
Thank you all for your interest today. It's nice to have people want to hear what we have to say. I think the themes that we emphasize are this is a holistic, integrated approach. You all mentioned many challenges. We do have a lot of challenges. And we don't have the luxury of only paying attention to this challenge and not this challenge. So it must be a holistic, integrated approach to security. And with that, I think that's probably all. That's how I'd like to end it.
All right, thank you, Marty. Matt?
Again, thank you to everybody. Thank you for moderating for us. We're very interested in making security, making it easy to do the right thing, making it easier to do the right thing than the hard thing. That control friction that Malcolm Harkins talks about sometimes, that's guaranteed to make people go around you. We were talking about people seeking out security programs. So as we look to enable mission, we're really trying to make that as painless as possible, so it's easier to do the right thing than to go around. And so for all our partners, other agencies, those kinds of things, we're very interested in the easy way, the smart way.
You need an easy button, right? You need an easy
With a
button.
million lines of code behind it, but yes, we need an easy button.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for your time today. I do wish we could have gotten more questions. Hopefully some of the panelists, I know some have a hard stop, but we'll be able to hang out and answer some of your questions outside the doors here after the panel. But thank you for being here, for your time, and coming into this, I'm sure, crusty roads this morning. So, and a big thank you, if we could please, for our panelists here, so that I think phenomenal job. Thank you very much.